So this week, one of our elderly ladies who's self-quarantined, she really has to be, she called because she was a little depressed and she was saying, just where's this going to go? All she sees is destruction. And so immediately I said, well, that's not completely true. Somebody sent me an email where in Venice, this video in Venice, the waters have become so crystal clear that you can see fish swimming in them now. That hasn't happened in decades and decades. And not only that, then there are swans swimming. And then dolphins came and swam in the canals. And you had these people videotaping them. The water was crystal clear. Because of the quarantine, in some ways, there's kind of this beauty erupting. And then in Wuhan, in China, because of the self-quarantine, there's a reduction in pollution. And suddenly the gray skies were clear, and sun was shining, and the birds returned. Or in Assisi, they're quarantined, but you have this image of people singing to each other from the balconies. Or one of our parishioners forwarded an email to me from his family in Italy. And the Italian was saying that in their neighborhood at 6 o'clock, they all play this Gloria Gaynor song, I Will Survive, and they dance in their doorways. And I just love how happiness is erupting. Or I had several people say, if there's anybody who's shut in and they need something delivered, since I'm not working, I'll do their shopping for them. All around the world, you have beauty erupting and nature healing and people stepping forward and appreciating their neighbor. And all around the world, we're realizing just how connected we really are. There is, in some ways, this awakening and a new birth. And yes, I know there's fear, but there doesn't have to be hatred. And yes, I know there's isolation, but there doesn't have to be loneliness. And yes, I know there's panic shopping. I saw it this morning. But there doesn't have to be selfishness. And yes, I know there's sickness, but there doesn't have to be a sickness, a disease of the soul. And yes, tragically, I know there's death. But there's also rebirth coming. And in fact, even the word quarantine, it's Italian for 40 days. And if you're Catholic, that should strike you. The history behind being quarantined is that if ships coming in, they didn't know if they were carrying diseases. And so they made them stay 40 days. And why 40 days? Because it's this Catholic image that's from the Bible. Always in 40 days, there's this new creation, rebirth. So after 40 days, the sailors could come ashore. And hopefully for us, with this quarantine after 40 days, we're hoping that we'll be reborn. That's why on this Sunday, all throughout the world, the clergy are wearing, technically it's called the color rose, but I know pink when I see it. And the pink symbolizes joy. It's not just that I'm walking around as a billboard for breast cancer awareness. It symbolizes joy, that if we take this quarantine, Lent, seriously, maybe we'll erupt in joy. And so all the readings have this idea of enlightenment or seeing the world differently. So the gospel reading, it is incredibly profound. And the gospel reading deals with enlightenment. And the Pharisees and the religious leaders, they think they're the ones who are most enlightened. And the real twist is the more and more the story goes on, you realize those who claim to be enlightened are the most blind of all. And the blind man, he has his sight restored. But more and more, not only is his sight restored, but he's the one who's becoming more and more enlightened. And they can't even see it. And it's making a statement about religion. Is religion supposed to open your eyes to see your own blindness? Or is religion supposed to keep you blind and not knowing the truth? Our hope is that our religion opens our eyes up to, yes, see the world differently, be able to name our own blindness and faults. That's what we're hoping for. And so in the story of the man who had his sight restored, it's really about baptism. No, it's really about what happens after baptism. And so it's obvious it's baptism for this reason. One, if you notice in Paul's writing, one of Paul's code word for baptism is enlightenment. You know, after you're baptized, you get a candle, you're enlightened, which means to see. Also, in the story, the guy is baptized in this sense, had his eyes healed at the pool of Siloam, which means one who is sent. That's one of the titles of the Messiah. Remember, the Gospel of John starts off with the Word was sent by the Father. The title for the Messiah, one is one who is sent. He's baptized in one who is sent, Christ. But the real action happens after baptism. So he physically gets his sight back. But it's not until he goes through a trial, it's not until he suffers a little bit, is his eyes even open more. And the more he has to defend his faith and suffer a little, he gains more and more sight. At first he says, Christ is just a man, which is true. Then he says Christ is a prophet. And then he realizes, no, Jesus is the Christ. There's this increasing enlightenment. And at the end, he ends up worshiping Christ. So his eyes were opened. Or same thing in the first reading with Samuel. Samuel, the King Saul, has gone crazy, and God asks him to anoint a new king and tells him to go to the sons of Jesse. So Samuel goes there, and he sees the oldest son. And the oldest son, he looks like Saul. Saul was abnormally tall. I think he was like 6'2", freakishly tall. The oldest son is freakishly tall and looks intimidating, and the prophet thinks, oh, clearly, this is the anointed one. And it's not. One by one, all the sons are not the one. So finally he has to say, is there anybody else left? And there's David. But, David's the youngest, and they didn't even consider him. Well, my personal feeling is that, and I think this is backed up with scientific evidence, that the youngest child is always the holiest. So they called David. And what it says there is a strange Hebrew, but it basically means David didn't even look intimidating. David's supposed to be this powerful king, or will be, and he doesn't even look intimidating. The prophet was thinking that the king had to look like Saul. But what God is teaching is that we have to learn to look with our heart. God sees the heart. And so on this Sunday, we're celebrating the second scrutiny. And for those who's just new here, we here really push RCA, evangelization. So we have a huge group, always, who are coming into the Catholic Church. And last week was a first scrutiny. That's when we pray to see our own personal sins. It's hard to see your own sins, but it's easy to understand what personal sins is. This week, we pray to see our social sins. Social sins are also hard to see, but to be honest, a little hard to explain. Social sins are sins that all of us do together. And I'll use the example of racism. So years ago when I was in McCall, there's this couple who I just loved from California. And at dinner, they're telling me that they belong to this country club in California that didn't allow blacks, but they're not prejudiced. That's the policy of the club. And my answer back was, but you're a member of the club. And they'd say, but we're not prejudiced. That's the club. And my answer would be, but you're a member of the club. And every time they'd say something, I would say, but you're a member of the club. And pretty soon, every time he would say something, the wife would say, he's just going to say you're a member of the club. But no, you could say, well, it's not me, it's the club. But you're a member of the club. That's a social sin. It's sins that we do together. It's not personal sin. Or takes the bishop scandal of all this abuse. You can say, well, that was the bishops, and most of those guys are dead. But if you know what social sin is, you should ask yourself, Why, as a church, did we elect leaders who didn't have any moral courage to stand up? That also is part of everybody's fault in the church, because you're a member of the club. Or everybody saw the spring break young adults partying in Texas and Florida, and you could say that was morally wrong. That is a personal sin they've committed. And it is shocking that in a pandemic, they were so selfish that they have to have their need to party, even though it endangered everybody else's life. Where's their patriotism for this country? When doctors and nurses are on the front lines, and doctors and nurses have 10 times more likely to come down with coronavirus, their only concern was, I have my right to party. What about the parents who paid for those vacations? That's their personal sin. The social sin would be us asking ourselves, what in our culture allowed for people to mature to adulthood where they only think about their own right to have a good time? And you could say, well, that was, teachers who gave awards out to every person who participated. But then you're just naming other people's personal sin. What have we done as a culture that allowed a whole generation to think just of themselves during a state of national emergency? Those are social sins. We pray that God reveal our blindness, open our eyes to our social sins. So on this Sunday, all of us are asking to see that. And those who are entering the church, we ask them to kneel for the first time that they're going through a scrutiny during the intercessions. And at the end, maybe at the end of this quarantine, this Lent, truly we will have something to rejoice. That maybe the earth in us can be reborn. And so together, please stand and let us profess our faith.